Captain Maya Rodriguez had been flying F-16s for 8 years when she first noticed the pendant. It was a routine training exercise over the Nevada desert, her squadron practicing formation, flying in preparation for their upcoming deployment. The morning sun caught something metallic dangling from her rearview mirror, a small silver locket she'd never seen before. Maya's hands trembled slightly on the controls as she recognized the intricate engravings. It was identical to the one her grandmother had worn every day until her death 3 years ago. The locket shouldn't have been there. Maya kept her cockpit sterile, regulation perfect. She'd performed her pre-flight inspection just hours earlier, checking every inch of the aircraft. Yet there it hung, swaying gently with the aircraft's movements, catching the light like a beacon. Her radio crackled with her wingman's voice, Lieutenant Jake Morrison, asking if she was maintaining altitude. Maya realized she'd been staring at the pendant for nearly 30 seconds, her fighter drifting slightly off course. "Copy that, Falcon 2. Maintaining formation," Maya responded, forcing her attention back to the exercise. But the locket remained in her peripheral vision, an impossible presence that made her stomach churn. Her grandmother, Elena Rodriguez, had been a fighter pilot in the early days when women weren't officially allowed in combat roles. She'd flown under a male identity, hiding her true self to serve her country. The locket contained a photo of Elena in her uniform, a secret she'd shared only with Maya. The training exercise continued for another hour, but Maya found herself repeatedly glancing at the pendant. Each time she looked, more details emerged that confirmed its authenticity. The tiny dent near the clasp where Elena had dropped it years ago. The specific pattern of wear on the silver chain. Even the way it caught the light seemed familiar, triggering memories of childhood visits when her grandmother would tell stories of her flying adventures. When the squadron landed back at Nellie's Air Force Base, Maya was the first to taxi to the hangar. She shut down her engines with mechanical precision, but her mind was racing. The maintenance crew approached for their post-flight inspection, and Maya climbed down from the cockpit with unusual haste. She needed to examine the locket more closely, to understand how it had appeared in her aircraft. But as she reached for the pendant, her crew chief, Master Sergeant Williams, called out to her. "Captain Rodriguez, we need to talk," Williams said, his expression unusually serious. "There's something you need to know about your aircraft. We found some irregularities during the pre-flight that we didn't catch initially." Maya's blood ran cold. Irregularities in military aircraft could mean anything from equipment failure to sabotage. She followed Williams to the maintenance bay, the pendant still dangling in her cockpit, its mystery deepening with each passing moment. Captain Jessica Chen arrived at the flight line early that morning, her usual routine of checking weather reports and mission briefings interrupted by an urgent call from base security. Someone had been tampering with aircraft in Hangar 7, where Maya's squadron was stationed. "Jessica," as the base's senior flight instructor and Maya's former mentor, had been asked to investigate potential security breaches. She'd known Maya since her academy days and trusted her implicitly, but protocol demanded thorough investigation of any unauthorized access to military aircraft. The security footage showed a figure in maintenance coveralls accessing Maya's F-16 around midnight. The person's face was obscured by shadows and the hangar's dim lighting, but their movements suggested familiarity with the aircraft. Jessica watched the footage repeatedly, noting how the intruder seemed to know exactly where to find the cockpit access panel. They'd spent less than 3 minutes inside the aircraft before disappearing into the hangar's maze of equipment and storage areas. Jessica's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. The intruder hadn't tampered with any flight systems or weapons. Instead, they'd accessed Maya's personal storage compartment, a small space where pilots kept emergency supplies and personal items. The security logs showed the compartment had been opened and closed, but nothing appeared to be missing. However, Jessica noticed something that made her pause. The timestamp on the security footage coincided with reports of a break-in at the base's historical archives. The archives contained records of military personnel dating back to World War II, including classified files on pilots who'd served under assumed identities. Jessica's clearance allowed her access to these records, and she spent the morning reviewing files related to female pilots from the 1940s and 1950s. What she discovered made her hands shake as she read. Elena Rodriguez, listed as Eduardo Rodriguez in official records, had been one of the most skilled pilots of her generation, flying dangerous reconnaissance missions over enemy territory. Elena's file contained photographs, mission reports, and personal effects that had been donated to the archives after her death. Among the documented items was a silver locket, described as containing a photograph of the subject in military uniform. The file noted that Elena's granddaughter, Captain Maya Rodriguez, had been contacted about the donation, but had never claimed the items. Jessica realized that someone with access to the archives had stolen Elena's locket and placed it in Maya's aircraft. The discovery led Jessica to a disturbing conclusion. Someone knew about Maya's family history and was using it to manipulate her. The timing wasn't coincidental. Maya's squadron was scheduled to deploy to a sensitive mission zone within the week. Jessica immediately contacted base security and began tracing who had accessed Elena's archived materials. The investigation was about to uncover a conspiracy that reached far beyond a simple break-in. Maya sat in the squadron ready room, staring at the locket she'd retrieved from her cockpit. The weight of it in her palm felt exactly as she remembered from childhood, when her grandmother would let her hold it during their long conversations about flying. Alina had been Maya's inspiration to join the Air Force, though she'd never known the full extent of her grandmother's secret service. The locket's presence in her aircraft felt like a message from beyond, but Maya couldn't shake the feeling that someone was manipulating her emotions. The squadron's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel David Park, entered the ready room with a concerned expression. "Captain Rodriguez, we need to discuss your aircraft's security breach. There are aspects of this situation that go beyond simple vandalism." Maya looked up from the locket, nodding the classified folder in Park's hands. Intelligence officers didn't typically involve themselves in maintenance issues unless national security was at stake. Park sat across from Maya, his demeanor professional but cautious. "The locket you found belongs to your grandmother, Alina Rodriguez. We've confirmed its authenticity through archived records. However, its appearance in your aircraft wasn't random. Someone with knowledge of your family history and access to classified materials orchestrated this." Maya's grip on the locket tightened as Park continued. "Your grandmother's service record contains information that certain parties would prefer remained buried." The intelligence officer explained that Alina's missions during the Cold War had involved gathering intelligence on Soviet aircraft capabilities. Her cover identity as a male pilot had allowed her access to classified facilities and personnel that would have been impossible for a woman at the time. Some of the intelligence she'd gathered had led to significant strategic advantages for the United States, but it had also created enemies who held grudges across generations. "We believe someone is using your grandmother's legacy to compromise your current mission," Park said, sliding a photograph across the table. The image showed a man in his 70s, distinguished but with cold eyes. "This is Viktor Petrov, former Soviet intelligence officer. He's been living in the United States for 20 years under asylum protection. Recent intelligence suggests he's been seeking revenge against American personnel who caused significant damage to Soviet operations during the Cold War." Maya studied the photograph, searching for any recognition. "You think he's targeting me because of my grandmother's actions?" Park nodded grimly. "Petrov lost his entire network because of intelligence your grandmother provided. He spent decades planning his revenge, and your upcoming deployment presents the perfect opportunity. The locket is psychological warfare. He wants you emotionally compromised before you fly your mission." The revelation that her grandmother had been a Cold War intelligence asset explained so much about Alina's mysterious past. The stories she'd told Maya about flying had always seemed more dramatic than typical military service. Now Maya understood that Alina hadn't just been breaking gender barriers. She'd been risking her life to protect her country while maintaining a false identity that could have meant imprisonment or worse if discovered. Colonel Patricia Hendricks called an emergency meeting of the squadron's senior staff. As the commanding officer of the 421st Fighter Squadron, she dealt with security breaches before, but the targeting of one of her pilots through psychological manipulation was unprecedented. The briefing room filled with Maya's fellow pilots, intelligence officers, and security personnel, as Hendricks outlined the threat assessment. The individual responsible for placing the locket in Captain Rodriguez's aircraft has been identified as working for a foreign intelligence network, Hendricks announced. This isn't just harassment. It's part of a larger operation to compromise our upcoming mission. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Their deployment wasn't just another routine assignment. It was apparently significant enough to warrant enemy attention. Maya's wingman, Jake Morrison, spoke up first. "What kind of mission are we talking about, ma'am? Standard deployment briefings don't usually involve counterintelligence concerns." Hendricks exchanged glances with Lieutenant Colonel Park before responding. "The mission has been classified above your current clearance level. What I can tell you is that our success depends on complete operational security and pilot readiness." The security chief, Major Roberts, presented his findings from the investigation. "We've identified 3 individuals with access to both the aircraft hangar and the historical archives. 2 are cleared maintenance personnel with no suspicious connections. The third is Dr. Amanda Foster, a civilian contractor working on a historical documentation project. Her background check showed no red flags, but we've discovered she's been in contact with individuals connected to Viktor Petrov." Dr. Foster had been hired 6 months earlier to digitize historical military records, a project that gave her unprecedented access to classified personnel files. Her academic credentials were impeccable, and she'd come highly recommended from a prestigious university. However, the investigation revealed that her research had focused specifically on Cold War-era intelligence operations, and she'd spent considerable time reviewing Elena Rodriguez's archived materials. "Dr. Foster disappeared yesterday afternoon," Roberts continued. "Her hotel room was cleared out, and she missed her scheduled flight back to the East Coast. We believe she's gone underground to avoid detection, but the damage may already be done. She's had access to operational schedules, personnel records, and classified mission parameters for months." Maya felt the weight of the locket in her pocket as she realized the scope of the threat. Someone had been planning this operation for months, using her grandmother's legacy as a weapon against her. The thought that Elena's heroic service was being twisted into a tool of manipulation filled Maya with a combination of anger and determination. She wouldn't let her grandmother's memory be dishonored by enemy agents. Hendricks concluded the briefing with a direct address to Maya. "Captain Rodriguez, you have the option to recuse yourself from this mission. Given the personal nature of the threat, no one would question your decision to step aside." Maya looked around the room at her fellow pilots, men and women who'd become like family over their years of service together. The idea of abandoning them because of psychological warfare was unthinkable. The squadron spent the following days in heightened security protocols, while intelligence officers worked to locate Dr. Foster and assess the full extent of the breach. Maya underwent additional psychological evaluation to ensure she could compartmentalize the emotional manipulation and focus on her mission responsibilities. The base chaplain, Captain Mitchell, was assigned to help her process the revelation about her grandmother's true service record. Captain Mitchell had counseled many military personnel dealing with family legacies and the weight of inherited expectations. "Your grandmother's choices don't define you, Maya," he explained during one of their sessions. "She made sacrifices so that future generations could serve openly and honestly. Honor her memory by being the pilot and officer you've trained to be, not by carrying the burden of her secrets." The locket remained in Maya's possession, though she'd stopped wearing it during flights. The investigation had confirmed its authenticity, and Maya found comfort in having a genuine piece of her grandmother's legacy. However, she also understood that keeping it close was exactly what her enemies wanted. The emotional attachment could compromise her judgment at a critical moment. Intelligence reports suggested that Viktor Petrov had recruited Dr. Foster through a network of academic contacts, using her genuine research interests to gain access to classified materials. Foster's expertise in Cold War history had made her the perfect asset for infiltrating military archives. The operation had been planned for over a year, with Foster's hearing as a contractor being the culmination of extensive preparation. Maya's fellow pilots rallied around her as news of the threat became known within the squadron. Jake Morrison organized informal training sessions to ensure everyone was prepared for potential complications during their deployment. "We don't leave anyone behind," he reminded the group. "If someone's targeting Maya, they're targeting all of us." The solidarity of her squadron gave Maya strength as she prepared for the mission. These were people she'd trained with, flown with, and trusted with her life on countless occasions. The idea that external forces were trying to divide them only strengthened their resolve to succeed. Maya realized that her grandmother's legacy wasn't just about individual heroism. It was about the bonds formed between people willing to sacrifice for something greater than themselves. As the deployment date approached, Maya made a decision that surprised even herself. She requested a private meeting with Colonel Hendricks to discuss keeping the locket with her during the mission. "Ma'am, I understand the psychological risk, but I think I can turn this weapon back on our enemies. They expect the locket to make me weak, but it actually reminds me of why I'm fighting." Dr. Amanda Foster sat in a cheap motel room outside Las Vegas, her laptop displaying encrypted communications with her handler. The middle-aged academic had never imagined herself as a spy, but financial pressures and ideological sympathies had gradually drawn her into Viktor Petrov's network. Her expertise in military history had made her valuable to foreign intelligence services, seeking to understand American strategic capabilities. Foster's recruitment had been subtle, beginning with an academic conference where she'd presented research on female pilots in World War II. Petrov's associates had approached her as fellow researchers, offering funding for expanded studies on classified military personnel. The money had been too good to refuse, and Foster had convinced herself that historical research served the greater good of academic knowledge. The operation to place Alina's locket in Maya's aircraft had been Foster's idea, born from her understanding of psychological manipulation and family dynamics. She'd studied Maya's personnel file extensively, noting the close relationship with her grandmother and Maya's motivation to honor Alina's memory. The locket represented a perfect pressure point, emotionally significant, but appearing innocent to casual observation. However, Foster hadn't anticipated the thoroughness of the military's counterintelligence response. Within hours of the locket's discovery, her cover had been blown and her escape routes compromised. The academic credentials that had gotten her past security screenings now made her a highly visible target. Her photograph was being circulated to law enforcement agencies across the Southwest. Petrov's communications were becoming increasingly urgent and threatening. The elderly Soviet operative had invested significant resources in this operation, and Foster's exposure threatened to unravel years of careful planning. Complete the mission or face the consequences, his latest message read. Foster understood that her value to the network was rapidly diminishing, and failed assets rarely survived long in the world of international espionage. The motel room's television droned in the background as Foster considered her options. She could attempt to flee the country, but her passport was likely flagged and her finances were limited. She could surrender to authorities and cooperate with the investigation, but Petrov's network had a long reach and longer memory. The academic who'd thought she was simply helping with historical research was now trapped in a situation far beyond her understanding. Foster's laptop chimed with another encrypted message, this one containing detailed intelligence about Maya's squadron's deployment schedule. The information was too sensitive and too current to have come from archived records. Someone else within the military structure was feeding information to Petrov's network, and Foster realized she was just one piece of a much larger operation. The revelation that the conspiracy extended beyond her own involvement terrified Foster more than the prospect of capture. She'd been recruited as an academic researcher, not a spy, and certainly not as part of a network that apparently included active military personnel. The scope of the operation suggested resources and planning that went far beyond what she'd imagined when she'd first accepted money for her research. Major Roberts coordinated the manhunt for Dr. Foster from the base's Security Operations Center. Multiple agencies were involved, including the FBI, military intelligence, and local law enforcement. Foster's academic background had initially made her seem like a low-priority target, but the discovery of her connection to Petrov had elevated the search to national security priority. The investigation had revealed that Foster's research contract had been arranged through a series of shell companies and academic fronts, all ultimately traceable to foreign intelligence services. The paper trail showed payments far in excess of typical academic consulting fees, suggesting that Foster had been compensated for intelligence gathering rather than legitimate research. Roberts' team had also uncovered evidence of additional security breaches at other military installations. Foster's access credentials had been used to query personnel databases at bases across the country, indicating a systematic effort to gather intelligence on military personnel with specific family histories or psychological profiles. The pattern of database queries revealed the sophisticated nature of the operation. Foster hadn't been randomly gathering information. She'd been specifically targeting military personnel whose family members had served in intelligence or special operations roles during the Cold War. Maya Rodriguez was just one of dozens of potential targets identified through this process. "We're dealing with a revenge operation that's been in planning for decades," Roberts explained to his team. "Petrov isn't just trying to compromise one mission. He's trying to systematically target the descendants of American personnel who damaged Soviet intelligence operations. This is personal vendetta elevated to the level of national security threat." The realization that Maya was part of a broader target list prompted additional security measures for other at-risk personnel. Military families whose ancestors had served in intelligence roles were being quietly notified and provided with enhanced protection. The scope of Petrov's operation was becoming clear, and it was far more extensive than initially realized. Maya's training intensified as the deployment date approached. The psychological evaluation process had concluded that she was mentally prepared for the mission, despite the emotional manipulation attempt. However, her commanding officers insisted on additional simulation exercises to ensure she could maintain focus under pressure. The flight simulator sessions were more challenging than usual, with instructors introducing unexpected complications and stressful scenarios. Maya found herself relying on her grandmother's stories of flying under pressure, using Elena's example of maintaining composure in dangerous situations. The locket, which had initially seemed like a weapon against her, was becoming a source of strength. During one particularly difficult simulation, Maya's aircraft experienced multiple system failures while under simulated enemy fire. The scenario was designed to test her ability to prioritize threats and make split-second decisions while emotionally compromised. Maya's performance exceeded expectations, with her instructors noting her unusual calm under extreme stress. Rodriguez shows exceptional resilience, her primary instructor noted in his evaluation. The psychological pressure that was intended to compromise her performance appears to have had the opposite effect. She's channeling emotional investment into enhanced focus and determination. The military's psychological warfare experts were fascinated by Maya's response to the manipulation attempt. Jake Morrison observed Maya's training with professional interest and personal concern. As her wingman, he would be responsible for supporting her during the mission if she showed signs of emotional instability. However, his observations suggested that Maya was actually performing better than her normal baseline, as if the threat had sharpened her focus rather than dulled it. The squadron's final briefing before deployment took place in a secure facility, with all personnel required to surrender electronic devices and submit to additional security screening. Colonel Hendricks addressed the assembled pilots with unusual gravity, acknowledging that their mission carried risks beyond typical combat operations. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been selected for this deployment because you represent the best of what American military aviation has to offer, Hendricks began. However, we now know that foreign intelligence services are specifically targeting this operation. Your professionalism and skill will be tested not just in the air, but in your ability to resist psychological manipulation and maintain operational security. Maya listened to the briefing with the locket secure in her flight suit pocket. The small piece of silver had transformed from a weapon against her into a reminder of her family's legacy of service. She understood now that her grandmother's sacrifice hadn't been just about flying dangerous missions. It had been about accepting responsibility for protecting future generations of Americans. The FBI's Las Vegas field office coordinated the search for Dr. Foster with military intelligence and local law enforcement. Agent Sarah Chen, who specialized in counterintelligence operations, took point on the investigation. Chen's experience with academic espionage cases made her uniquely qualified to understand Foster's motivations and likely behavior patterns. Foster's credit card records showed purchases at a pharmacy and an electronics store, suggesting she was preparing for an extended period in hiding. However, the transactions also revealed a pattern of erratic decision-making that indicated someone under severe psychological pressure. Chen's profile suggested that Foster was more likely to make mistakes the longer she remained at large. The electronics store purchase was particularly interesting. Foster had bought a high-powered radio scanner and equipment typically used by amateur radio operators. Chen suspected that Foster was either trying to monitor law enforcement communications or attempting to establish contact with her handlers through alternative communication methods. Local law enforcement had been provided with Foster's photograph and vehicle description, but Chen cautioned against aggressive apprehension tactics. Foster is an academic, not a trained operative, Chen explained to the tactical team. She's likely to panic if cornered, which could lead to unproductive outcomes. We need her cooperative if we're going to unravel this network. The investigation had also revealed that Foster's academic research had been more extensive than initially realized. She'd accessed personnel records dating back to the 1940s, documenting American intelligence operations throughout the Cold War. The information she'd gathered could compromise operations and personnel far beyond Maya's current situation. Chen's team worked around the clock to trace Foster's movements and predict her next actions. The FBI agent understood that Foster represented their best chance of dismantling Petrov's network before it could target additional military personnel. However, time was running out as Maya's squadron prepared for deployment. Viktor Petrov sat in his modest apartment in Brooklyn, monitoring news reports and encrypted communications about the unfolding operation. The elderly Soviet operative had spent 20 years in the United States, living quietly on asylum protection while secretly planning his revenge against American intelligence operatives who had destroyed his career and killed his colleagues. Petrov's network had taken decades to establish, recruiting assets through academic conferences, cultural exchanges, and carefully cultivated personal relationships. Dr. Foster had been one of his most successful recruits, her genuine academic credentials providing perfect cover for intelligence-gathering activities. The operation against Maya Rodriguez represented the culmination of Petrov's planning, but it was also just the beginning. His network had identified dozens of potential targets, all descendants of American personnel who had caused significant damage to Soviet intelligence operations during the Cold War. Each target represented both a strategic opportunity and a personal satisfaction for the aging spy. However, Foster's exposure threatened to compromise the entire network. Petrov had already activated contingency plans to protect his other assets, but he knew that American counterintelligence capabilities were formidable. The operation he'd spent decades planning might be unraveling before it could achieve its full potential. The encrypted communications with Foster had become increasingly desperate as the academic realized the scope of her situation. Petrov felt no sympathy for her predicament. She'd been well compensated for her services, and operational security had been her responsibility. Failed assets were simply casualties of the intelligence war that had been ongoing since the end of World War II. Petrov's apartment was spartanly furnished, reflecting both his advanced age and his operational discipline. The walls contained no personal photographs or mementos that might reveal his true identity or background. However, hidden behind a false panel, he maintained files on every American intelligence operative he'd identified over the years. Elena Rodriguez's file was among the thickest, documenting her operations and their devastating impact on Soviet intelligence networks. The old spy's hands trembled slightly as he reviewed Elena's file one final time. She'd been responsible for the deaths of at least 12 Soviet operatives, including Petrov's own younger brother, who had been betrayed and executed after Elena's intelligence had exposed his network. The Locket operation against Maya had been deeply personal for Petrov, representing both strategic opportunity and emotional closure. Maya stood on the flight line at dawn, watching her F-16 being prepared for departure. The aircraft gleamed in the morning light, its weapons systems loaded and flight systems checked multiple times by the maintenance crew. This would be her final training flight before the squadron deployed to their classified mission location. Master Sergeant Williams approached with the aircraft's final inspection report. "She's ready to fly, Captain. Every system is green, and we've implemented additional security protocols to prevent any unauthorized access." Maya nodded, appreciating the extra attention to detail that had followed the Locket incident. The pendant now hung openly from Maya's rearview mirror, no longer a source of confusion or psychological pressure. She'd made the conscious decision to incorporate it into her flight routine, transforming what had been intended as a weapon into a source of strength. The locket represented not just her grandmother's memory, but her own determination to honor that legacy through excellent service. Jake Morrison performed his own pre-flight inspection nearby, his F-16 configured identically to Maya's. The two pilots had flown together for 3 years, developing the kind of wordless communication that made them effective as a team. Morrison had noticed Maya's increased focus and confidence since the Locket incident, and he was curious to see how it would affect her performance in the air. The morning flight was designed as a final systems check and formation practice before deployment. Maya and Morrison would fly a standard training route over the Nevada desert, practicing the kind of precise maneuvering that would be required for their classified mission. The exercise was routine, but both pilots understood that their performance would be closely monitored by commanders assessing their readiness. Maya climbed into her cockpit with familiar efficiency, running through her pre-flight checklist while the locket swayed gently in her peripheral vision. The pendant caught the morning light just as it had on that first day, but now Maya found its presence comforting rather than disturbing. She was Elena Rodriguez's granddaughter, and she was ready to prove herself worthy of that legacy. The tower cleared Maya and Morrison for takeoff, and the two F-16s rolled down the runway in perfect synchronization. Maya felt the familiar thrill of acceleration as her aircraft lifted off, the desert landscape falling away below. This was what she'd trained for, what her grandmother had dreamed of when she disguised herself as a man to serve her country. As the formation climbed to altitude, Maya's radio crackled with Morrison's voice. "Falcon lead, you're looking good. How's the emotional payload handling today?" It was Morrison's way of checking on Maya's psychological state without being overly direct. Maya smiled at her wingman's concern and professionalism. "Emotional payload is secure and contributing to mission effectiveness," Maya replied. It was true. The locket and everything it represented had become integrated into her identity as a pilot rather than being a distraction from it. The psychological warfare had backfired completely, strengthening her resolve rather than weakening it. Agent Chen's investigation team located Dr. Foster's abandoned vehicle in a remote area of the Mojave Desert, approximately 50 miles from Las Vegas. The car had been carefully wiped clean of fingerprints, and Foster's personal belongings were gone. However, the FBI's forensic team discovered evidence that suggested Foster had met someone at this location before abandoning the vehicle. Tire tracks indicated that a second vehicle had been present, and footprint analysis showed that Foster had walked voluntarily to the other car. Chen's team found no signs of struggle, suggesting that Foster had been extracted by Confederates rather than being abducted. The discovery indicated that Petrov's network was more sophisticated than initially assessed. The remote location was strategically chosen for the extraction, far from populated areas and surveillance cameras, but close enough to major highways for rapid escape. Chen's analysis suggested that Foster's handlers had anticipated her exposure and prepared contingency plans for her extraction. The academic was now completely underground, protected by a network with extensive resources and planning capability. However, Foster's extraction also represented an opportunity for Chen's investigation. The FBI agent understood that removing Foster from the operational area indicated that Petrov's network was preparing for the next phase of their operation. Foster's intelligence gathering had been completed, and her handlers were now positioning for whatever action they'd planned against Maya's squadron. Chen coordinated with military intelligence to analyze Foster's research patterns and predict potential targets. The investigation had revealed that Foster had focused particularly on pilots and aircrew members whose family histories included intelligence operations. Maya Rodriguez was just one of several potential targets, all scheduled for deployment to sensitive mission areas. The pattern of Foster's research suggested that Petrov's network had identified a specific operational window, a time when multiple targeted personnel would be deployed simultaneously, creating maximum opportunity for disruption. Chen realized that the threat against Maya was part of a much larger operation designed to compromise multiple military missions simultaneously. Maya's squadron completed their final training exercises with exceptional ratings across all performance metrics. Colonel Hendricks reviewed the results with satisfaction, noting that the psychological pressure had actually enhanced the unit's cohesion and determination. The attempted manipulation had unified the squadron rather than dividing it. The pilots spent their last evening on base in quiet preparation, checking equipment and reviewing mission parameters one final time. Maya found herself in the squadron's heritage room, studying photographs of previous commanders and notable missions. Her grandmother's era wasn't represented in the official displays, but Maya understood that Alina's contributions had been equally important despite being unrecognized. Jake Morrison joined Maya in the heritage room, bringing 2 cups of coffee and settling into a nearby chair. "You know, whatever happens on this deployment, your grandmother would be proud of how you've handled this situation, turning psychological warfare into motivation. That's next-level pilot stuff." Maya smiled, touching the locket through her flight suit pocket. She spent her entire career hiding who she was to serve her country. I get to serve openly, honestly, as myself. That's the real victory here. The conversation was interrupted by Colonel Hendricks entering the room with news that would change everything. "Squadron, we've received intelligence that suggests our deployment timeline has been accelerated. We launch in 6 hours instead of tomorrow morning. The threat assessment has indicated that delaying could compromise mission security." Maya and Morrison exchanged glances, understanding that the investigation into Foster and Petrov had uncovered something significant. The squadron scrambled to complete their final preparations as maintenance crews worked around the clock to ensure all aircraft were mission-ready. Maya performed one last inspection of her F-16, checking that the locket was secure and wouldn't interfere with any flight operations. The pendant had become part of her equipment, a reminder of her legacy and responsibility. As dawn approached, Maya stood with her fellow pilots on the flight line, watching the sun rise over the desert. In a few hours, they would depart for their classified mission, carrying with them the knowledge that foreign intelligence services were specifically targeting their operation. The psychological warfare had failed, but the real test was just beginning. The intelligence briefing that preceded their departure revealed the scope of Petrov's network and the multiple threats facing American military personnel. Maya realized that her situation was part of a much larger pattern of revenge operations targeting the descendants of Cold War intelligence operatives. Her grandmother's legacy had made her a target, but it had also prepared her for this moment. Agent Chen received a priority communication from FBI headquarters as Maya's squadron prepared for departure. Intelligence analysts had decoded additional communications from Petrov's network, revealing the true scope of the operation. The psychological warfare against Maya had been just the opening phase of a much larger attack planned against multiple military installations simultaneously. The decoded messages indicated that Petrov's network had assets positioned at various military bases across the country, all prepared to execute coordinated operations against specific personnel. The timing of the attacks was planned to coincide with major military deployments, maximizing the operational disruption and psychological impact on American military leadership. Chen's team worked frantically to identify and neutralize the various threats before they could be executed. The FBI agent understood that Maya's squadron was flying into a situation where multiple enemy agents were positioned to disrupt their mission. However, the accelerated departure timeline made it impossible to delay the deployment for security reasons. The communication intercepts also revealed that Dr. Foster was being held at a secure location, probably against her will. Her extraction from the desert had been protective rather than supportive. Petrov's network was eliminating loose ends and preparing for the final phase of their operation. Foster's expertise was no longer needed, and her knowledge made her a liability. Chen coordinated with military intelligence to establish secure communications with Maya's squadron during their deployment. The FBI agent understood that the pilots would need real-time intelligence updates as the situation developed. The psychological warfare had been just the beginning of a much more complex and dangerous operation. The investigation had also revealed that Petrov's network included at least one active military insider, someone with access to operational schedules and mission parameters. This discovery meant that Maya's squadron was flying into a situation where their own security could be compromised from within. The threat was evolving faster than the defensive measures could be implemented. Maya's F-16 climbed through the dawn sky, her squadron forming up in perfect formation as they departed for their classified mission. The locket swayed gently in her cockpit, catching the morning light as it had on that first day when she discovered its mysterious presence. Now Maya understood that the pendant represented not just her grandmother's memory, but a direct connection to the ongoing intelligence war that had shaped American military operations for decades. The radio chatter was minimal as the squadron maintained communication discipline during their departure. Maya knew that enemy agents were listening, analyzing their communications for intelligence about their destination and mission parameters. The psychological warfare had been replaced by electronic warfare, but the underlying threat remained the same. As the formation flew east toward their classified destination, Maya reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Her grandmother's hidden legacy had made her a target, but it had also prepared her for the challenges ahead. Elena Rodriguez had flown dangerous missions while hiding her true identity. Maya would fly her mission as herself, openly and proudly representing American military excellence. The locket would remain with Maya throughout the deployment, a reminder of the sacrifices made by previous generations and the responsibility she carried to honor that legacy. The psychological warfare had failed, but Maya understood that the real test was just beginning. Her grandmother's example would guide her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The F-16s disappeared into the morning sky, carrying their pilots toward a mission that would test everything they'd learned about duty, honor, and the price of freedom. Maya Rodriguez flew toward her destiny, carrying with her the accumulated wisdom of generations of American military personnel who had sacrificed everything to protect the nation they loved. The story of the locket had become a story of resilience, determination, and the unbreakable bonds that connect generations of military families. Maya's grandmother had fought her war in secret. Maya would fight hers in the open, but both were part of the same continuous struggle to preserve American values and security. As the squadron faded into the distance, the investigation on the ground continued, with Agent Chen and her team working to unravel the remaining elements of Petrov's network. The psychological warfare had been defeated, but the intelligence war continued, as it had for decades and would for generations to come. The locket that had once been a weapon had become a symbol of victory, representing the triumph of American military values over foreign manipulation and psychological warfare. Maya Rodriguez flew toward her mission carrying not just her grandmother's memory, but the pride of every American military family that had sacrificed for the cause of freedom. The fighter sirens that had once rattled the sky in fear now sang with determination, as Maya and her squadron carried forward the legacy of American military excellence into whatever challenges awaited them in the classified mission ahead. The Pendant continued to catch the light, a beacon of hope and remembrance in the vast expanse of the American sky.